They lived in an inhospitable environment. They fetched drinking water from infested drains and canals. Diseases were rampant, and medical care was woefully inadequate. As a consequence, deaths occurred on a regular basis. The empty bowels of compassion were most evident.
In fact, most of the Indians, for long periods of indentureship, had to go and relieve themselves in the fields, in the drains, in the areas outside of these barracks, which is one of the reasons for a very high incidence of hookworm. Because the Indians were not provided with boots, for example, they had to move barefooted most of the time, and then they had to walk in these areas which were open toilets, you can say, and therefore the incidence of hookworm was very high indeed. It was one of the continuous problems, and there were constant admonitions to the estate owners that you should build latrines so that the Indians would use that facility. But not every estate owner wanted to expend further money in building further facilities.
In addition to the health hazards, the immigrants would unfortunately face open hostility from the freed slaves, who accused them of being strikebreakers or scab labor, because they accepted a 24 cents daily wage, which the Africans had justifiably refused after they were freed. In agreeing to work for 24 cents a day before leaving Calcutta, the immigrants were unaware of any negotiations between the planters and the freed slaves.
They were simply told when they left India and when they came to the Caribbean that your wage is 24 cents a day. And they were ignorant, they were oblivious of the earlier disputes that had taken place between the Africans and the plantation owners. So in their point of view, 24 cents was in fact the average wage. This is what they were being offered. This is what they had contracted themselves to receive for 5 years, and therefore they accepted it, not knowing the earlier difficulty. But the African, not knowing that the Indian was ignorant of the labor dispute, he blamed the Indian for coming and accepting what he called a slave wage. And this was always a source of contention between African and Indian, because the African argued that had the Indian not come, then it's quite possible the planter would have been forced to raise the wage to an acceptable level. But he saw the Indian as a strike breaker, as a person who was displacing him on the plantations.
Notwithstanding these conditions, fixed in their minds would be the task of fulfilling their contractual obligations, and in the process further enrich the planters, which they would achieve with passionate ease because of their obeisance to Dharti Mata, their dedication to duty, and devotion to and knowledge of their agrarian way of life. For the first half of the year, life on the estates meant work from dawn to dusk. The Jahajis would head to the sugarcane fields long before sunrise to harvest the crops, while the planters and the rest of the nation were still enjoying their sleep.
It was dawn to dusk during crop season, as it had been for the African. So once the crop season had started, then it would be, you would have to get up at 5 in the morning, start work at 6, and you go to 4 or 5 in the afternoon. So one can say for about the 3 months of the crop season, it was really very difficult, it was very arduous, it was really dawn to dusk.
The women of the estates had multiple responsibilities. In addition to preparing the meals and managing the household, they looked after the children even whilst assisting their husbands in the fields.
When a woman arrived as an adult, she was indentured. So we have to be clear in our minds that women were indentured also. So that an adult woman arriving, and quite a few of them arrived with small children because they had been married in India, she was obliged to work. Her tasks were slightly different from the tasks typically given to men, but the fact is she was expected to turn out every morning, Monday to Friday, and do field labor or other jobs. If she had small children, generally I think on the estates, an older woman looked after the very small children. Children from the age of 6 or 7 were drafted into the labor force. They were not indentured, but they were expected to give labor. They were just paid a few cents for cutting grass and that kind of job, looking after animals. So yes, indeed, she had to juggle, as working women always have had to, multiple responsibilities. She certainly had to do housework and cooking in her barrack room or perhaps the cottage wherever she lived. She would have to do childcare, and as long as she was indentured, she would be expected to turn out each day to do her task. It's true that on the better managed estates, pregnant women or women nursing babies would not be expected to do a full task every day. But the contract required women as well as men to perform labor.
When she returned, the home chores would begin all over again.
Life as an indentured Indian woman on the plantations was a very hard life. They had to do hard physical labor. Their living conditions were wretched, and they were vulnerable to sexual abuse by plantation staff. And, let us be honest, by Indian men. Because in addition to the overseers, who were generally white, you had the sirdars or drivers, and these were Indian men given positions of authority. And there's pretty good evidence that some of those men also abused the younger women.
During crop over, the immigrants would engage in equipment repair and general off-season maintenance in readiness for the next harvest. For 13 cents per day, some women would plant and salt the canes, while others would weed and dig paragrass in the noonday sun. These simpler post-crop chores would allow them a little more time to practice the agrarian skills they brought, adding to what the Africans had already started centuries before.
They added their own crops such as swamp rice. That is something that they brought, things like guava, new strains of bananas, pomegranates, mango, and then the water buffalo, which they call the bhais, the zebu bull, the zebu cow, new varieties of goats, all kinds of vegetables, a whole wide range of different kinds of pulses, different kinds of bhaji, peppers, all kinds of new crops and new animals which changed the whole physical landscape with the cultivation or the rearing of these animals.
But even among the immigrants, life on the sugarcane plantations was not as sweet as many had hoped it would be. There were many anxious moments between the immigrants, between overseer and laborer, and driver and worker. The central source of the discontent originated from a type of control instigated by the planters and perpetrated by the gang leaders. The movement of immigrants was regulated by a system of ordinances that kept them isolated on the plantations. They journeyed from one place to another only through official passes when it was absolutely necessary and at the sole discretion of the overseers. Failure to obey the rules, the immigrants felt the full force of cruel taskmasters, which included swift and brutal punishment that often resulted in pernicious flogging and invariably unnecessary and humiliating incarceration. In this case, punishment was not reserved only for the male, but for the weak and defenseless women of the estates. This type of subjugation often evoked fierce but ineffectual reactions from the men, who felt that they alone had the right to punish their wives and soulmates.